Why Africa chose China. You won't believe what the United States did. The ever-expanding influence of China in Africa traces back to Beijing's initial support for liberation movements against colonialism. This foundation laid, the relationship underwent a significant transformation in the 1990s, taking on new dimensions with the surge in Chinese commercial activities. The launch of the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013 marked China's formal commitment to strengthen global trade relations, particularly with developing countries. As we delve into the contrasting perceptions of China and the United States in Africa, a captivating narrative unfolds. You're certainly wondering, what does the future hold for these complex relationships, and how will they impact the African continent? Cultination is here to answer your questions. Without any delay, we begin now. China. Engagement in Africa. For over 20 years, China's significant actions in Africa include providing loans for infrastructure development, typically designed and constructed by Chinese companies, and the extraction of resources by Chinese mining and energy companies. While countries like Ethiopia, Angola, and Zambia have been priorities, China has expanded its footprint across most African nations. A notable trend since the Cold War is the substantial strengthening of Chinese influence in Africa. While American influence has stagnated economically, China has surpassed the United States, becoming Africa's top bilateral trade partner, with a trade volume of $254 billion in 2021. This amount is 4 times the level of trade between the United States and Africa. In terms of foreign direct investment, China also outpaces the United States, supporting hundreds of thousands of jobs in Africa, approximately double the level of American foreign direct investment. Currently, China remains the primary financier for African countries. The future looks promising for Chinese business activity in Africa, thanks to the spectacular growth of the Chinese economy, now the second largest in the world. This expansion is closely linked to China's increasing need for raw materials to support its extensive manufacturing base. However, this growth also reflects the deliberate efforts of the Chinese government to make significant strides on the African continent. In this dynamic, it's not challenging to say that Africa prefers China. You may already understand why, but the reasons are multifaceted. Why Africa favors China. Contrary to Western beliefs, Africans do not see themselves as victims of Chinese economic exploitation. During the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in September 2018 in Beijing, the President of the African Union, Paul Kagame of Rwanda, praised China's aid and investment strategy in Africa, describing it as a source of profound transformation. He emphasized that Sino-African cooperation is built on mutual respect and benefits both parties. This perspective is shared by African leaders, evident in their active participation in the summit. However, while African leaders view China as a valuable partner, the idea that Beijing is perceived as a predatory actor in Africa, seeking to recolonize the continent, remains prevalent in foreign policy circles, media, and academia. This is a reality of which the presidents are aware. As President Kagame highlighted, the debt trap is not an inevitable consequence of loans. He pointed out that the expected outcome of this debt depends solely on Africans themselves. Indeed, the success of Chinese loans in Africa hinges on how African governments use these funds for productive investments. For these investments to work, African governments must be accountable to their populations. This responsibility does not fall on China or other non-African countries, but rather on Africans themselves. Clearly, China remains an attractive partner for Africa for several compelling reasons. Firstly, China provides loans without conditions and access to capital. In 2016, trade between China and Africa reached $128 billion. Marking a significant increase from $1 billion in 1980. During the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in Beijing, China generously offered $60 billion for development financing. Chinese loans at reduced rates have allowed many African governments to avoid pressures from global institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, which often impose Western standards of accountability and conditions tied to political and economic reforms. This contrasts with the Western structural adjustment model, which may not always benefit Africans. China's unconditional cooperation has also provided African governments with access to funding, expertise, and development assistance, thereby strengthening the ties between China and Africa. Despite financial crises elsewhere in the world, China remains committed to investing more in Africa, offering an alternative development model that appeals to many countries on the continent. The second reason is that China increasingly plays a key role in helping African governments respond promptly to the growing demand for services and infrastructure from their populations. Chinese companies assist in providing services such as transportation, education, health, and telecommunications, creating a growing enthusiasm for their activities in Africa. Thirdly, China is now involved in peace and security projects in Africa. Chinese troops participate in 8 United Nations peacekeeping missions, 5 of which are in Africa. Moreover, China is the second largest financial contributor to UN peacekeeping missions and has provided financial support to the African Union mission in Somalia, AMISOM, and the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, mediation in South Sudan. Fourthly, China's rapid and successful economic growth can serve as an inspiring model for Africa. Many African countries are motivated by China's achievements and seek to emulate the East Asian giant. China has successfully lifted around 800 million people out of poverty in 40 years through its non-traditional development approach, achieving numerous Millennium Development Goals. African leaders and scholars can draw inspiration from China's success in development and sovereignty. All in all, in the current state of affairs, China is already gaining favor among Africans. The West must either adjust its strategy or risk perpetually trailing behind. It is crucial for Africans to take control of their destiny, leverage competition between major powers and regional players, whether from the West, the Far East, or the Middle East. The West's problem: when American leaders visit Africa, they talk about China, but when Chinese officials visit Africa, they talk about trade and development. The relationship between China and Africa is viewed from 2 opposing angles or perspectives. On one hand, there is the critical view often adopted by the West, as illustrated by various statements against Sino-African relations. For example, during an information session at the Heritage Foundation, former U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton announced China, labeling it a new colonizer in Africa. He accused China of using bribery, opaque agreements, and debt to keep African states under its influence. This kind of criticism extends to the United Kingdom and France, which see China as a threat to peace, supporting controversial regimes and exploiting corrupt and incompetent governments. In the West, the Sino-African relationship is perceived as harmful, labeling China as a commercial opportunist and a massive polluter of the African environment. But here is where the friction occurs and the misalignment with the West takes place. The second, opposing perception that favors the partnership between Beijing and Africa is the one adopted by Africa itself. Why? China was the only one offering investment without restrictive conditions and focusing on the continent's real development. It is seen as a reliable ally, devoid of colonial baggage, capable of providing unconditional financing. Most Africans believe that China understands and respects African priorities, with a reputation as a respectful actor of cultures and states. Respect is what Africans have always demanded and is now a criterion to which they attach great importance. Academic literature and the media sometimes unfairly perpetuate a negative view of China and Africa, wrongly portraying it as a predatory actor. Although China invests heavily in the extractive industry, it also devotes a significant portion to infrastructure, construction, energy, production, and finance in Africa, even surpassing other developed countries in these sectors. Perception of China and the United States' engagement in Africa regarding American engagement on the continent. Eric Hollander, co-founder of the China Global South Project, CAP, and a veteran journalist in major media organizations worldwide, including CNN, BBC, and France 24, explains that during the Cold War, Africa was crucial for the United States, but without benefiting Africa. Today, with the return of rivalries between major powers, the repercussions persist. When Americans talk about maintaining a rule-based order, Africans see a system that has not really helped them. For many, the order in place during the Cold War and the economic challenges of the 1980s and 1990s did not benefit Africa much. This is why the United States now views Africa as a problem to solve, adopting the aid approach, a persistent approach that Africans now disapprove as they move away from the aid industrial complex. Africa wants a more modern and flexible approach. Concerning China's engagement, the Belt and Road Initiative has changed many things, making Africa less crucial for China. Africans sometimes see themselves as a neglected part, believing that their only value lies in what they can offer to the international system. Conversely, the Chinese see them as significant voices at the United Nations. Although Africa has political power, African leaders do not fully exploit this opportunity to obtain Chinese concessions, sometimes remaining indecisive about their policies. Dear community, we unfortunately have reached the end of our video, which I hope has been informative for you. Before you leave, don't forget to like and, most importantly, subscribe, because our adventure is yet to be continued with all of you. Goodbye.